Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's BioSpace event, How to Shine as Biotech Comes Back from the Brink. I am Annalie Armstrong, Senior Editor for BioSpace. Today, we're bringing together three CEOs from BioSpace's 2026 NextGen list, a group of biotechs we believe are the next big thing in biopharma. We are going to discuss the current state of the biotech markets and the issues that are keeping our CEOs busy. We're going to get started in a moment, but just a few notes before we begin. Attendee phones are in listen-only mode. Questions are welcome. Please write them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll leave about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A, but you can submit them anytime and we'll do our best to get to them. Questions are anonymous to other attendees. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and all registrants will receive a link following the event should you want to share it or review after. If you're not very familiar with BioSpace, we're the leading news and career site in biopharma with over 1 million monthly visitors and hundreds of thousands of subscribers. We have a bunch of free newsletters you can sign up for on biospace.com using the subscribe button in the top right corner of the website. So let's get on with our show. Our first guest is Andy Orth, CEO of City Therapeutics, which is a new biotech that is working on next generation and RNAi therapeutics. Next, we have Eric Green, CEO of Trace Neuroscience, which is chasing a new target for ALS. And finally, we have Mo Trika, who joins us from Kivu Bioscience, which is developing ADCs, which is one of cancer's hottest modalities. So thank you all so much for joining me today. So let's dive right into our questions. First up, I always like to start these webinars with this exact question. Can you each describe the current biotech markets in 1 to 2 words? Andy, I'm going to go to you first.
Great. Yeah, happy to. I think I'll use a couple words appropriate with the season here in New England, and it's really green shoots, right? I do see signs of life here. Mainly on the financing side and where that's opening up a little bit. But also I continue to be impressed with the underlying progress here out of the pipelines and the platforms of companies like the guests we have here today. So happy to share anything else.
It's great to hear optimism. Mo, let's go to you next.
Yeah, so thank you, Annalie, and appreciate the invitation. I think to me, the single word that comes to mind this morning is transformative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another really positive word. When we did this webinar last year, things weren't as positive. Eric, would you go ahead?
Sure. Yeah, I think I'm going to say data-driven, which is that I think we've seen a lot of instances where, in a productive way, when you have companies coming forward with really positive data, particularly in the clinic, that it's being rewarded. And that I think that's really where everybody's focus is. And I think we'll get to talk about this later, but we've been fortunate to, I think, see a number of really positive data releases that over the past couple of weeks that have given us that reminder of just how positive things can be when you do something important in the clinic.
Yeah, for sure. And not just data releases. There's been some great approvals. I know Denali had a Hunter syndrome drug approved recently. But just kind of speaking to the clinic, I know RevMed, they doubled survival in pancreatic cancer, which really was incredible to see. But how is that translating when we talk about the markets? How are investors reacting to that? And is it kind of bringing them back into the space? Mo, let's start with you.
I think it's a very exciting time. Yes, the short answer is I think it's bringing investors back. I think, to your point about the data from Revolution Medicine as well as from Denali, I think, it is really a transformative period, Emily. I mean, we are also raising the bar. So I think things that, to Eric's earlier point, it is data driven. I think, there's always a lot of emotion that happens in the market space, but the ones that stick to it and stay grounded and are data driven, I think do win out at the end. And I think we'll get into this a little bit more, but we do have to raise the bar. Things are becoming competitive, and it isn't about the news that you generate in the next 3 months, but really thinking about what data inflection points are you going to get over the next 2 to 3 years. And we have to think about those market data-driven inflection points.
Mm-hmm. And Andy, how are investors reacting to the good news stories?
Yeah, I think as what I've seen, particularly in the fundraising side of the world, City's building both a platform and we have a clinical pipeline that's emerging right now. I think the investor focus has been disproportionate on that clinical and when that data is coming out for us. And between fundraising I'm doing right now versus what I was doing a year ago, luckily our company has advanced and we're in the clinic at this point. But the reactions generally are focused on that earlier stage clinical data versus any kind of platform activities.
Hmm. And Eric, do you want to answer that one as well?
Uh, Yeah, and I think the RevMed and Denali examples are really good ones, and that they both have shown really nice clinical data, but also are innovative in terms of the technologies and approaches, and really step function changes to what we've seen before in terms of that both the mechanisms and the kind of approaches that they're taking. And so I think it has reminded people of the power of these more transformative, even kind of, seemingly risky approaches, but when they're done in a disciplined way and can demonstrate through clinical data that they are really making a difference for patients, that's where the value lies.
Hmm. So all of you have been out raising money. Andy, you spoke to this a little bit, but I guess when you think about where you were when you were raising kind of your initial seed rounds and where you are now, how has the fundraising scene changed? Eric, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, kind of thinking back, with a broader swath, I think, if we look back over the course of the past, say, decade or so, I think, we saw a time to Andy's point when there was just a huge amount of enthusiasm about, how can we do more? How can we think about platforms with greater breadth and thinking about how we can fund that? And, the pendulum I think swung very far back in the other direction towards, okay, how can we do things in the most kind of incremental and disciplined way, focused really on clinical assets that have been de-risked. I think we have now seen over the past couple of years a bit of a correction there towards something where yes, I think it's critical to be able to have clear line of sight to clinical data, but a recognition that we don't want to make things as narrow as possible, and that thinking about can we combine that kind of discipline with innovation, with platforms. I think we've now started to see a bit of a middle ground that's emerging.
Hmm. And Mo, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think in the last couple of years, I've seen, the pendulum kind of swing, and we need to be mindful of, uh, are we developing best in class therapeutics and
Hmm.
medicines? And where is the first in class? So how do investors and how do we think in terms of what is truly innovative? And there seems to be this emphasis on, well, let's make the best in class agent. And I have to be honest, I mean, at Kivu we are also building in what we call best in class, but we also have to remind ourselves that real innovation also comes from taking certain calculated risks. So to the discussion we were having earlier, we are in a position where we've got clinical stage assets that are showing benefits with antibody drug conjugates, and clinical data always takes front and center. But I also want to keep reminding folks that there the preclinical programs, or that are still in laboratory testing, we also need to devote enough time, and we should continue to provide innovation, because this isn't just for the next 3 to 5 years, but how are we as US as well as global innovation going to continue to ultimately bring novel medicines and transformative medicines for patients across all therapeutic areas. I think we need to keep mindful of best in class and first in class medicines and
Hmm.
platforms, I would like to add.
Yeah. And Andy, anything to add, like kind of comparing your fundraises?
Just, I think as the company has evolved, the shareholder, the investors we're talking to has also evolved. And I'm still very, healthcare focused investors are clear targets, not generalist at this point in time. But there is also, for my particular case here, a segment of healthcare investors who are deeply educated on RNAi already. That's a different conversation for me than someone who just is new to the modality. So segmenting on that front for me is also very different from where we were a year ago, and what we've been able to show in terms of data on the new platform and things today. So it can be a little complicated depending on who the audience is.
Mhm. Just jumping to the regulatory side, it's impossible to talk about the biotech markets right now without talking about the FDA. There's been a lot of tumult at the agency. There's been a lot of changeover. We're hearing some stories of biotechs that are getting unexpected responses from the FDA, and some, rejections.
Yeah.
I know that all three of you are early stage, but how are you watching kind of your peers' conversations with the FDA at this time? Are there any lessons that you're taking away, or any practice changes that you're implementing? Mo, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think this is such an important topic, right? And my thinking and feedback to my team is, and that there's stuff that comes out in the regulatory, and sometimes I say to myself, you know, what I suggest to my team is let's separate fact from fiction. So not everything in the media that shows up. So we are an early stage company. We've got programs moving into phase one. So remain grounded. There, send your briefing book, or if you're engaging with the agency, make sure you continue to maintain very high standards. And so in my world, we're seeing no changes in cycle times and the quality of feedback. Having said that, we also have to think about, what's going to happen once we're past phase one and we're thinking about end of phase one. The second piece of advice that I'd like to share with whoever's working in this space is, if possible, we should also build relationships within your respective organizations with regulatory agencies outside the U.S. And there are lessons that we can learn. What's going on. It's also a dynamic environment in Australia, in China, in countries in Europe, because agencies do talk to each other. So I think
Mhm.
we've got to recognize that. We have to be mindful, and you have to add a certain amount of time, which is challenging, because if cycle times with the agencies are delayed, that has a direct ripple effect in, whichever stage program you're working on, phase one or BLAs or NDAs. So those would be my advices. Recognize changes in agencies within the United States, engage with them early and often, but also outside the US, and ask them the same questions.
Mhm. Eric, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Mo captured a number of the points that have been really key for me, which is that, first of all, we have had interactions with US FDA, and those interactions have been, very constructive, and we've been impressed with the quality of the review that we've seen, and very, very scientifically driven. Um, you know, that being said, I think for a lot of reasons, I'm seeing early stage companies really taking a more global regulatory approach, from the get-go, whereas there may have been some companies that, really were entirely focused in the US, at least as part of their early development, that are, we're thinking more and more about, how do we integrate across a number of different regions from the get-go. And I think that's, partly as we're responding to some of the uncertainty, but also just, with an eye towards being able to move forward, especially these first-in-class therapies as efficiently as we possibly can.
Mhm. And Andy?
Yeah, I think interestingly, even companies, these smaller ones our size, our current phase one right now is ex-US. Phase one we're about to put into play mid-year is also going to be ex-US. These were more for reasons of a well-trodden path for RNAi therapeutics that many of us had experience with in the past, as opposed to avoiding the FDA. But I think both Mo and Eric said it here is my peers who are dealing with the FDA right now are having, frankly, a pretty good experience. But it remains their work has to be of high quality. They have to be highly transparent and all the rest. So hopefully it continues to go in the right direction here and leadership stabilizes and we can all get back to confidence. And I think maybe this is an opportunity for a little bit of progression here. And if other people are going ex-US for reasons of speed or quality, maybe that's something we can address in this period of change.
Mhm. That is a perfect jumping off point to talking about Chinese innovation. I think like clinical trials are going to places like China and other areas, but innovation is also going the other way. So what is your take on this new source of biotech innovation, these new therapeutics? How can biotechs that you are running, such as yourselves, how can you compete in this environment when it seems to be pretty easy for a pharma to go over there and find, 10 assets that they can work on? Andy, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, and this is we could have an entire webinar on just this one, right? And it's a really hotly debated topic right now across the industry. Um, and for me, I am directly competing with companies there in siRNA and RNAi and a bunch of other right technologies that we're front and center with. And my firm belief remains that competition is good for everybody, and at the end of our industry, it's going to be good for patients. And we need to behave in an offense manner, meaning increased funding for NIH, increased regulatory flexibility at the FDA, other things we can do to make biotech better, faster, and easier in the United States, as opposed to more defensive measures, which I think are also being put somewhere on the table here. So, and it is not necessarily an equal playing field. If in China, it is an purely organized effort to lead in biotech, and those regulatory hurdles and funding is coming from the government, and we're going the opposite direction, it's hard. So we need to fix that. And I really want us to focus on that here. We have partners in China, et cetera. And I think that's the case you're finding across the board in all companies of all sizes. So much more to come here, but at the heart, I'm a fan of competition, and we're rising to it. It's got to be innovation. That's where we started this industry, and that's where we have to hold this industry.
Mm-hmm. And Mo, do you want to take that one next?
Yeah, I was just smiling and thinking, Andy, completely agree with you, right? I'm here in California, and the sun is shining and it's a beautiful day. And I say the competition and what's happening in China, bring it on. I think we have to embrace it. We have to bring and build, a Golden Gate Bridge, because the Golden Gate Bridge includes collaboration, and you have to embrace, if you really want true innovation, and we remain grounded on, at Kiva Bioscience, our mission statement is we're inspired by patients, fueled by data to accelerate the development of transformative medicines. And with patients in the United States, in San Francisco, should be just as important to us as in China or in India, or to live locally and think globally. So part of what we have to do is to figure out it's not just about pharma and biotech running clinical trials in China. What can we do to allow that two-way traffic?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I see this as an opportunistic time because, let's be honest, the government NIH cutbacks are having a direct impact in U.S. academics, right? I mean, those are the ones that, Andy, Eric, and I tend to talk to, investors and markets, public, private, equity, so on and so forth. But our academic colleagues are 100% or largely dependent on funding from the NIH, and that has been directly impacted. So how do we build that Golden Gate Bridge that allows investors, biotech companies, and academics, and increasing that collaboration that says what kind of innovation? So that would be one place that I say, building a two-way Golden Gate Bridge traffic. Second part is, I think we also have to recognize that do we continue to strengthen our intellectual property?
Mm-hmm.
So part of the challenge is I would like tell folks to say, and I've actually got to reach out. Maybe this, Annalie, don't want to put more pressure on you, but maybe another topic would be a webinar would be IP space and patent protection. A lot of our scientists don't know that. And how do you find the right balance between presenting at a scientific conference versus protecting your IP? So let's educate, inform, and empower U.S. innovation. And that's what I think our country's done really well.
Mm-hmm.
And keep your North Star focused on bringing medicines for patients.
Yeah. Mo, we'll have you over for our next BioSpace webinar brainstorming session for sure. And Eric, what's your view on Chinese innovation?
Yeah, I think I'm, largely pretty well aligned with what we've heard from these two. And just, the comment that Mo closed with is one that we think about a lot, which is that, as we consider these questions of, how might we deal with competition? How might we be able to collaborate with those in China? We, especially as a company that is so focused on a particular disease area, ALS, and a particular group of patients, that is, I think, the litmus test that we always apply is, how can we do this in a way that is going to be beneficial to people with ALS around the world, and that's who we're dedicated to. And if that means working with groups in China, well, then that's the right thing for us to do. And so I think that's helped us to navigate some of the complexities there. And one other comment that I'll make is that I think one thing that I think we've all been reminded of, seeing some of the developments in the ecosystem in China over the past several years, is just how powerful even small amounts of human data can be. And I think that's been the reminder of some of the kind of early clinical development um, uh, kind of examples that they've had there across a number of indications where, running trials in 5 or 10 people can teach you something that you might never learn by doing, animal studies for a decade. And so I think it's been a good reminder of some areas where, there's opportunities for change and innovation here in the US.
Mhm. Eric, I know that, Andy mentioned that RNAi is definitely, he's seeing the competition. I know Mo, ADCs are huge in China. So are you seeing the direct competition that Andy and Mo are from China, or is neuroscience still something that hasn't taken off as much there?
I think it's been a little bit less prominent than some other areas, but I've been impressed actually with some of the work that is going on in neuroscience there, particularly at the interface of neuroscience and genetic medicines. I mean, Andy talked about siRNA, and there's like quite a bit of, I think, activity there that I would call, pretty cutting edge as you think about work in gene therapies, work in siRNA. So I think it's not quite as the scale of it is not the same as we see in some other areas, but it is, I think, certainly been a priority at a national level, and we're seeing that play out in terms of some of the work that's coming out of China.
Mhm. A few of you touched on kind of the funding situation in the US, particularly grants from the NIH that have really been slashed. And, that has led to this kind of brain drain situation where scientists are going elsewhere, which is unfortunate. But when we think about US innovation in the future, where does the money come from to fully support what the biotech ecosystem is doing here? Mo, do you want to start with that one?
Ah, okay. Uh, so where does the money come from? So I think, look, money will come. I tend to be optimistic about um, American, our country's entrepreneurial mindset.
Mhm.
And, I think we just have to recognize that times are tough. But, when things are tough, the tough get going. And I think we have to find ways to, particularly, there is money in the market, right? I mean, look at the stocks, look at where the public markets are going. Look at you. We started off by talking about, wonderful, amazing, transformative data coming from Revolution Medicines and Denali. So if you continue to provide transformative data that improves the lives and the quality of lives of patients, so where the money will come from an early stage, like where, part of where U.S. innovation and investment was that we would take calculated risks, and the venture model and the pharma investment model was let's bake those bets preclinically. I'm a big believer, yes, clinical data is, in some ways supersedes preclinical, but I at the same time would say you need preclinical, you need innovation. So how can we build a collaboration between our universities, between our early stage, and Eric was touching upon this, that 5 patients worth of data can teach you a lot. Well, how do we simplify the quality and the speed of our clinical trials in the US? Why does it take so long for US academic medical centers to get a clinical trial started? I'm living with this right now. The
Mhm.
speed and efficiency that you can get outside the US, I think we should have a lessons learned there. So I would say collaboration, stronger collaboration between US pharma and biotech with academics. Number two, simplifying our clinical trials processes in parallel and saying, how can we get patients, our medicines in patients, even in the United States, because there are geographic differences between patients that respond from a pharmacological perspective in China compared to the US. So we have to be mindful of those geographic differences. Data integrity would be the third part that I would say. Make sure your data is reproducible and has integrity. And then lastly, I think just building those clinical trial collaborations and engaging with the agency
Mhm.
and saying, how can we simplify our processes? What lessons can we learn? Those would be the four things I would recommend.
Mhm. Anyone else want to tackle that one? Like how we kind of where the money is going to come from in for future biotech in the US?
Hmm.
I think I would just emphasize, I think how critical the investments in basic science and academic basic science are to this ecosystem. I mean, you talk about the work that we've done at Trace, and we've done a lot to translate and develop a medicine, but all of it is built on a bedrock of work that was done through academic funding, and we're not alone in that. I think the Revolution Medicine example is a terrific one. Huge amounts of work that occurred in the context of several biotechs, all built on a really strong foundation of academic science. And so I think that it's critical to the ecosystem. And it's something I worry a lot about as we think about this point of how do we continue to innovate on first in class, really transformative medicines. It requires a healthy biotech ecosystem, but the foundation of it continues to be investment in academic science. And my hope is that, although this has been a tumultuous time for that investment, that there continues to be support from multiple different, across the political spectrum, and recognizing that has been a huge part of the engine of our success and medical innovation in this country.
Mhm. Andy, anything to add?
Fully agree with those points, and it's really, Annalie, it's not a solvable problem. That lack of NIH funding for that basic science is not something that can be handled by the private sector or anyone else. It's something that we could deal with just a little less productivity if it was just us. But back to our China point, they're going the opposite direction faster, and we did this at the same time. And that's what makes this a little bit more nerve-wracking for all of us. But there is no other market mechanism to do what that has undone. And we've got to put that money back. I think that's the only real solution here. This isn't a pain we're going to feel in the next 6 months. This is a pain we're going to feel in the next decade, and we've got to put it back.
Yeah. Just last question on China. There is starting to be some data that is showing that maybe the kind of low-hanging fruit has been picked, that these deals are getting more expensive. It's getting harder to find really quality assets. So I feel like I know the answer to this question, but like, was this just a brief moment? Is China here to stay, or can the US recapture the spotlight? Andy, I'll go to you first.
Yeah. I think the low-hanging fruit might be just a little bit overly simple. I think, yeah, we saw a number of deals in the last 2 years, and obviously BMS just did one very recently here. And it's not necessarily the science low-hanging fruit. What I actually think is happening is that the Chinese companies are no longer interested in selling these for 1 penny on the dollar. They are going to become global players. And they will not have the need for us to come in there and buy all these assets to commercialize them in the US and globally. I think they're going to be able to start to do that on their own. So I do think that will add a little bit of pricing pressure that will give them, candidly, pricing strength, and will probably lower the deal flow a little bit.
Mm-hmm. And Eric, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I do think we're starting to reach a new equilibrium here, where I think, as we've seen in a lot of other industries that have been developing in China, there is a moment where the priority is just on growth, and I think that allows there to be some opportunities for people to come in and buy things at prices that are not going to be sustained over the long term, in exchange for, I think, building the industry in the way that it's developed over the course of the past several years. So I think we're reaching an equilibrium where I think the opportunities are still there, but maybe not at the same pricing. And so I think we're trying to think about, I think there still is a lot of opportunity there, but I think it's going to look different going forward than maybe it has over the past several years.
Mm-hmm. And Mo, do you want to wrap things up on that question?
Yeah, so I don't think it's a cyclical thing. I think the deal flow and the benchmarks of the recent deals, and the one that was mentioned about with BMS in China, the Innovent Takeda, the benchmarks are going up, and I think investors are going to recognize that it's not as easy to pick it up on a penny and a dollar, is what Andy referred to. I think China's here to stay. I would encourage our entrepreneurial mindset for us to say, well, how can we bring some innovative programs into China? Because China is also a growing market, right? I
Hmm.
mean, let's be candid based on what they're approaching. So what is it that we can do rather than just pharma and investors saying, let me go pick something up in China? I think we should be saying, how can we build that Golden Gate Bridge and bring our programs and our medicines into China? Because there are ways that we could tap into. So I think that would be kind of, I say the market size is growing and getting bigger. And I'd say, why stop there? Why not think about other Asian countries? I think we should be thinking about building that. There's a huge information, and it's not just China, but what can we do with building that collaboration with our European colleagues? Because
Hmm.
they're feeling it too, right? It's
Yeah.
not just US. So how can we collaborate even better and stronger with our colleagues in Europe? I would say let's think about ways even in Japan. That's an
Mhm.
untapped market. So let's just raise the bar, but and not just think about bringing programs from them. Lastly, I would say, Emily, that I think we have to remind ourselves, and maybe we'll get into this or not if time permits, but data integrity and reproducibility. So several of this information, when you have an influx, especially I'm living with it right now in our ADCs, there's a lot of antibody drug conjugates. But my guidance is to say, how much of this data is reproducible? What is the data integrity? And how do we think about artificial intelligence and actually recognize what is reproducible, not only in China, but also in the United States or in other parts of the world? I think that's a very important part that we have to recognize. Because you're also
Mhm.
going to see a lot of programs that are going to get terminated, would be my prediction after we start to recognize and say. So that would be a part that I'd like to wrap up.
Yeah. We're going to talk about AI in a few minutes. I want to just address an audience question, which I think perfectly dovetails with what we're talking about. So the question is, any perspectives on the evolving roles of global public-private partnerships in advancing our scientific innovation objectives?
Hmm.
Andy, do you have any thoughts on that initially? Would you like to start?
Yeah, this is what kind of came to my mind as well when you asked the NIH question, and could that funding gap be bridged? And we've seen some examples of this where this has worked really well, right? Giving a shout out here to a local one, Mass Bio is one of those that has been fundamentally, helpful in creating this biotech ecosystem that I'm sitting in the middle of here in Kendall Square. Could something like that come to play in an NIH-like funding mechanism where, frankly, they attach a little bit of ownership to it and maybe some downstream profits? Possibly, but not when China is doing what they're doing at the same time. I like the idea, and I think it's creative, and I think it'd be interesting, but it's hard to do that when there's a different market operating, across the ocean here that's so prolific.
Hmm. Yeah, I was just in Salt Lake City touring Altitude Labs, which is doing a similar thing.
Yeah.
They offered to step in a little, as much as they possibly could when the NIH grants were pulled. But that's a huge gap.
Yeah.
Um, Eric, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, as I think across some of the the examples that we have here, I mean, so California Institute of Regenerative Medicine, a good example that's put a lot of funding into support, particularly gene and cell therapies, and I think these have been really valuable parts of the ecosystem. I think they are. It's an and rather than an or. These are not going to be mechanisms that I think are going to replace what we see from NIH. But between things, the world of ALS in particular is one where there's been a lot of good examples of nonprofits that have come in and that are providing important funding both to basic science, but also to companies. We've been fortunate to be involved with a group called Target ALS that's been really valuable here. all of these, I think, are great complements, but they are not going to be in a position to replace what we've gotten from places like NIH.
Mm-hmm. And another really good audience question that kind of goes to what Mo was saying about the IP aspect of this. Let's see. How do you balance this collaboration with innovation protection? Mo, do you want to take that one and maybe get a little bit into your elevator pitch on what needs to be done on the IP side of things?
I think we need more engagement thinking about this public-private partnership concept as well. I think we need to educate our scientists from an IP perspective. Let me be candid with you. When I was in graduate school, I wasn't taught a single business course in my PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology. There were some hard lessons I had to learn when I switched from academics to industry. And it was like, whoa, where did this come from? I think if there could be a way to say, look, you have to train the next generation, our younger generation folks that are just entering the field of saying, what is intellectual property? How do you separate from what is patentable versus a trade secret? So the sooner you can educate that component, the sooner we can have what I call healthy collaborations. And I think there should be, let's reach out to our IP colleagues. Patent attorneys are expensive. Sorry, apologies to anybody out there, but it does cost a lot of money, okay? How can we educate and bring that in when somebody's thinking about a novel technology, a novel target, a novel platform? I think that would be my elevator pitch there. Lastly, I would say public-private partnerships those are band-aids to me. We've got to really get to the heart of the matter. It comes down to money. And you got to continue to support our academics and true innovation, because if those innovation, we just have to continue to convey that message. And we should be speaking about it at these conferences. We should be speaking about it at scientific conferences, and engage with your local community representative and highlight the importance of why it's so important. Because public-private partnerships by definition have, they're two different goals, right? If you're a nonprofit, you have a certain nonprofit goal. We are building a for-profit. So let's put some money and encourage our academics to stay there and try those crazy ideas. Keep innovating.
Just to keep you on the spotlight, Mo, Kivu is developing ADCs, which, as we mentioned, has been one of the biggest things to come out of China. There was a huge rush of deals into ADCs. So how are you kind of trying to stick out in such a busy space and kind of maintaining the spotlight on a company like Kivu right now?
Yeah. So thank you for that question, and it's a really great question. I mean, if you want to innovate, then don't follow. So what is the Kivu mantra, right? I've been developing cancer medicines for 20 plus years, and I think that the Kivu approach is to build kinder, gentler, and more efficacious ADCs. So it isn't just about innovation in ADCs coming out of cancer, but I think you have to think of cancer as a chronic disease. And when you think of cancer as a chronic disease, if you truly want to conquer cancer, then you have to think about risk to benefit ratio. Historically, it was always about, oh, I got efficacy, and I have amazing antibody drug conjugate data that shows dramatic efficacy, but overall response rates or short-term responses, patients cannot stay on those treatments. So you have to increase the safety bar. And that's what we mean by saying, of course, you need efficacy. You want to prolong life in cancer patients, but at what cost? What is the quality of life? So I think that's where we're trying to differentiate at Kivu, because using our site-specific conjugation technology, lowering the drug to antibody ratio, we're trying to increase the dose such that patients can have the responses and stay on those high doses. And that's an area that I think, is the approach that we've managed to be successful in bringing Kivu ADCs in a differentiated manner. And that gets us excited about that.
Mm-hmm. And Andy, you are also part of a pretty quickly moving space in RNAi. Your company, City, was of course spawned by Alnylam legend John Maraganore, who's been busy. I want to talk about the deal that you struck with Biogen. You kind of brought them into RNAi. Can
Yeah.
you talk about how that partnership came together amid this kind of like renaissance for RNAi?
Sure, sure. Um, one of the things that is defining City Therapeutics, right, is this capability that we have on what we're calling the next generation of RNAi, and that is both the siRNA or derivatives thereof and innovations on that front, as well as delivery. And what really, I think, attracted Biogen to us as a partner, and this is really a little bit of an interesting example along with the conversation we were having about overseas competition right now. All siRNAs are not created equal. There is a lot of manual screening and know-how that exists, and we're fortunate enough here to have people who really helped crack the code on that at Alnylam a decade ago or more. So I think Biogen was really attracted. They have a delivery mechanism for systemic CNS administration and wanted to attach a modality that they're attracted to, and that's RNAi, and asked us to help build that siRNA for them. So great partnership that's been active now for a bit over a year and highly productive. So thrilled to do it with them. And there happened to be our neighbor right down the street here, so easy.
That's always nice. And Eric, you're again also part of kind of like what I would call a neuroscience renaissance. You're in a very difficult space, tackling a new target for ALS, which has really seen some kind of mixed news lately. How have you kind of navigated some of those conversations with investors being on the earlier side of this? How do you kind of keep them committed in a field that is a real roller coaster ride?
Yeah, I think neuroscience, maybe particularly neurodegeneration, neuropsychiatry, I mean, these are the great unmet needs of the next several decades. We have limited treatment options. These are hugely prevalent diseases with really severe morbidity, and we need to find novel treatments in these disease areas. And I think that's always where these conversations start. The challenge is there's a limited set of areas where I think we really have sufficient understanding of the biology of disease to be able to intervene in a meaningful way. And where I think one area where we've seen some success is places where we have a strong understanding of the genetic drivers of disease. And ALS is a really good example of this, where we've seen an ASO targeting SOD1, a known genetic driver of disease that has been really transformative in that subset of people with ALS. And so, the set of examples in neuroscience where we understand the genetic driver, we understand the mechanism by which that's working, and then we have an intervention that can be precisely targeted to that mechanism. I think right now that is a small set, but when those conditions are met, I think people are excited enough to say, okay, this is a place where we really are ready now to make an impact. And I'm hopeful that over time, in ALS, I think we are starting to see some examples of this in Huntington. There are several other areas where I think where we're meeting those conditions, and over time, I hope that we'll get to a place where we can really expand that.
Yeah. So we're getting some really great questions from the audience. I just want to remind everybody to please get those in. We are going to have some time for questions at the end. But now I think is a good time to pivot to AI, which I know is a subject that everybody's pretty passionate about. I think there's been some really major deals recently in this space. Investors have a big focus on this. It's almost, something that is a must-have. So as early stage biotechs, do you feel pressure to like add AI technology to your work? And how are you navigating that? Mo, do you want to start?
So, short answer, I'm not feeling any pressure because of the stage that we're in, right? We're at Kivu, we have antibody drug conjugates that are, we've already identified the clinical candidate. We're running clinical trials, and we're in that what I call the valley of death of taking programs from GLP toxicology to clinical proof of concept. I think part of the question comes up is how do you incorporate AI into early discovery and drug target identification, and how does that play out? My approach here would be to say, maybe this is a little bit of a philosophical question. As a leader in an organization, I'm saying I'm not looking for artificial intelligence. I'm looking for real intelligence because, I have limited budget. Okay. Ideas are cheap and time is something that patients don't have. And biotech companies and anybody doesn't have time. Money I can always find. So give me the right data package that allows us to make the decision. So it isn't about more data, it is getting the optimal data. So how do you get that and separating artificial from real? So how am I going to look at 5 patients worth of data and make a decision? Do you go out there and find 50 more? So that's the place that we look at. Uh, I would also say that I think a lot about is how there's a lot of information being generated. How much of it is reproducible?
Mm.
What is the error rate? And are we somehow compounding, I'm not much of a social media user, but the more likes, does that just mean that, that is real? Or how do you separate what is fact from fiction?
Mhm. Yeah. Andy, do you want to tackle the AI topic?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't uh, I'm not feeling pressured externally in any way, shape, or form. However, I think our teams in general, particularly on the research side and our, higher end genetics and data analytics teams, are being exceptionally opportunistic on this front and are frankly finding ways to do things faster. These were things we were already doing, and now we're doing them faster. And some of them we might be, able to just have the throughput has increased, et cetera. But I don't think it's fundamentally shifting exactly what we're doing on a regular basis, in particular of, creating best-in-class RNAi molecules. Um, there are things coming that are going to disrupt how we develop and discover drugs. So we can't have our head in the sand, but I'm also cautious of being distracted on this front. And I'm really just trying to make sure we're balanced on that front. I have a couple people walking around these halls who are exceptionally excited about it. And, I can be too, but also just trying to keep ourselves focused.
Mhm. And Eric, how are you integrating AI or cautiously looking at this technology?
Yeah, I'd say, right now in the context of Trace, where, we're a company that's hyper focused on advancing, a single medicine for ALS in a lean organization, I'm focused on how can we infuse this end to end throughout the entire organization to make us more efficient and able to do more with the team that we have. And that's, partly on how do we think about the design of clinical trials and analysis of large existing data sets of natural history. We did a collaboration with a group called Unlearn AI that has built an approach to developing digital twins that we've been employing in that way, but also across how do we think about our our G&A functions and how can we make those more efficient by incorporating AI? How do we think about our early planning on marketing commercial and how can we make those more efficient with AI? So I think we've been really focused on that aspect of not just how can we use it for scientific innovation where we have been exploring, but how can we use it to make the organization more efficient and allow us to do more with less?
Mhm. I think off the top, we talked about how important clinical data is to biotechs, early stage biotech specifically. But then you see somebody like Isomorphic raising more than $2 billion in a Series B without naming a single candidate, no preclinical data, and nothing. So how is that impacting like the early stage fundraising environment? Do you think it's maybe siphoning off some people who would be interested or who could maybe, have some good opportunities with, early stage biotechs? Andy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think it's that much of a fixed pie that it's literally siphoning it off from one in order to give to another. I think you're gonna always find a different group of investors who have that particular vision or that particular risk tolerance. And I think for those of us, I haven't seen it change that much of I'm interested now in the platform side of the world or, your promise from a decade of now. I still think it's going to be grounded in that data here for quite some time. But there are going to be, people who are very attracted to some of those earlier plays and have that risk appetite.
Hmm. Mo, any thoughts on that one?
So a couple thoughts here. I was when you asked that question, what flashed through my mind was there is so much new information that comes out, right? Every time I turn on the news or turn on, read stuff, I've started to read more than listen to the news. Uh, I think we have to remain grounded. And when you embark on a journey of whatever medicine or platform, disease type you're working on, you need to be aware of the competition, but be a palm tree and not a banyan tree because the competitive world is changing, right? So you have to be flexible, but you can't always keep changing because if you have 5 patients worth of data and suddenly your sixth patient gives you a totally different direction, is 1 out of 6, is that signal to noise? So I think we've got to also stay focused and recognize that you have limited resources, be responsive to this approach, and also be flexible, but remember to challenge the data. Because ultimately the medicines that truly hold up the test of time in the marketplace, in the community, are the ones not just in clinical trials, but also moving forward. Lastly, I'd say, there's a kudos to the isomorphic folks and, wherever that goes. We just have to recognize it and we have to figure out when is the right time to adopt. And you need both. You need true innovation, first in class, and you need best in class. And you need to put patients front and center in whatever endeavor that you're working on.
Hmm.
And basic research is equally important.
Yeah. We had just a comment from an audience member that said, just to you, Mo, directly, I wish more drug discovery leaders would take up Mo's comment on less AI, more genuine intelligence. That really resonates with me. So, Eric, any thoughts on kind of how AI is impacting fundraising on kind of, I don't want to say less or more traditional biotechs, but companies that are doing like what you're doing?
Yeah, I have not had the sense, for the most part that, people are viewing side by side, do I want to put this next dollar into isomorphic versus do I want to put this next dollar into trace, that they, are coming from different pools of capital and sort of a different thesis. And, from a kind of global standpoint, like I'm glad that these big bets are happening and trying to see about how can we really take a bet on something that we don't fully understand how it's going to impact our field, but obviously there's a ton of promise. And, I think we're in a, well-functioning ecosystem when you can have both, which is that you can have those big long-term speculative bets, and there are investors who are going to support that, and others who are going to be more focused on, okay, how do we have a concrete plan to get to value generation through clinical data. I think we've seen some isolated examples where there can be tension between those, but I think by and large, these two can coexist.
Mhm. So this is I'm going to dive into our audience questions now because there's a lot that are just kind of touching what we're already talking about. But just like not specifically focused on AI, we have a question here. It seems like money is going to very fast horizon, late stage clinical programs or very early stage, still being proven platform companies. And promising phase 1, 2 clinical companies are being left out. Do you see that? Do you have any thoughts on why that is? Eric, while I have you, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, I think it is definitely true that there is, there are sort of two big groupings here. There are the big idea platform, very early platform companies that are betting on transformative technology. And then there are the companies that are I'd say, a more traditional biotech thesis around funding to clinical value inflection. Where I see the gap is actually in between those two, which is the kind of the innovation on identifying new targets in a focused way in a disease area of interest. And, it gets back for me, to some of that discussion that we were having about basic science funding through NIH, is how do we make sure that we have function in that part of the ecosystem? Because that's where I really have seen challenges in funding. It's less, once you're getting to the point that you're running phase 1, 2 clinical trials, provided that there's a line of sight towards, getting proof of concept data, I think we do have a functioning, funding ecosystem there. The challenge I really worry about is how do we think about development of new targets, in a less sort of broad platform AI way, but in a more traditional kind of basic science translating into medicine's way.
Yeah. Andy, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think that category of company, in some ways, right, City is that category. We've got a phase 1 right now, and by the end of the year, we'll be in a phase 1 and a phase 2. We also are fortunate, though, that we do have a platform that's under development, right, which we're able to share data on some very interesting innovations on extrahepatic delivery and other types of things. So we have kind of both going for us. That hasn't, hindered us from finding people willing to invest. I think even at those earlier clinical stages, can show some data, be de-risked on that front, you are able to attract capital right now.
Mm-hmm. All right, another audience question here. How aggressive are you in seeking better diagnostics for more precision, accurate data, and speed to findings? Mo, do you have anything on this one?
So obviously in oncology, right, precision medicine, has definitely played a dominant role. And I believe, and Eric and Andy could comment, but outside of oncology and autoimmune diseases, I think, there's talk about even in neuroscience and neurodegenerative diseases, the role of precision, patient selection, and genetic approaches. So I can speak from an oncology perspective. I think diagnostics are extremely important. Bringing the right medicine, whether you're developing an ADC or a small molecule or an IO therapy, RNA gene therapy, I think patient selection is extremely important because let's find the responders. I think diagnostics is part of our day-to-day conversation that happens whether in oncology drugs. I would say, and my challenge and request and ask of everybody in the audience who is working in the diagnostic space is build diagnostic markers in cancer patients that will predict toxicity. A lot of times in oncology, patients' clinical trials don't pan out because we have unacceptable toxicity. And how can we predict and identify patients that will perhaps have toxicity? Why does a certain ADC have interstitial lung disease? One patient has interstitial lung disease, but the other one doesn't. So it isn't about patient selection and increasing response rates, but also think in those terms. Because in the phase 1, phase 2 question, Annalie, that the previous investor asked, that's where a question from the panelists that came up. That's the world we're living in right now. And with Kivu, because we've got clinical trials going on, and the question is, the stakes are higher. Where are you going to find money? And investments are being put in later stage approaches. So really, really important question that was asked.
Mm-hmm. And Eric, I know that the diagnostic question is something that's happening in Alzheimer's. We're starting to see it more in neuroscience. How is this something you're looking at Trace?
Yeah, it's a really important issue, I think, across neurodegenerative diseases, and ALS is a good example of this, which is, the typical person with ALS has a life expectancy of 2 to 3 years, but also has a latency to diagnosis of about 1 year, and so it really limits our ability to have a period of time where we can treat patients. My hope is that we will see diagnostics advance hand in hand with therapeutics here. And as we start to see therapeutics that are bending the curve and improving outcomes, that we can really motivate a push towards finding people earlier through a combination of different approaches. And I think there are a number of things that look promising at the level of different circulating biomarkers. And I expect as we start to see some progress in therapeutics, that will really drive us to push towards identifying patients earlier.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going through our last questions here. We have 1 more minute. There was a question about the FDA's push for drug repurposing and how that kind of impacts IP. I don't know, Mo, do you have any thoughts or does anyone want to tackle that question?
in 30 seconds or less?
Do your best, do your
Okay,
best.
okay. So basically, I think FDA's initiative is a very remarkable and commendable initiative, and I think you have to factor that in. I would say, uh, you have to recognize intellectual property. So they are two sides of the coin. So I think innovation requires new molecular entities. You've got to bring in the IP component when you repurpose a drug.
Mhm. Yeah. All right. Well, this has been a really great session. Does anybody want to, I might just go to each of you and just kind of sum up your thoughts. Andy, do you want to just kind of, sum up your thoughts on the markets and kind of where we're headed? Maybe, on a more optimistic note.
Yeah, yeah. I'm naturally optimistic at this point. I don't have to
Great.
fake it. Yeah, I do see again, um, really good things happening across the innovation spectrum, locally and globally, that continue to give me confidence, right? That's how we're going to lead and really continue to drive biotech forward in the next decade. And I do think the investment climate is seeing that, and funds are moving on that front. You're seeing M&A happen on a regular clip right now and a handful of other things, which I hope are continued good signs here.
Yeah. Eric, your last thoughts?
Yeah, I think specifically with the focus on neuroscience, we saw some recent data coming out of Biogen, going out of one of our really well-known genetic targets of tau in Alzheimer's, and I'm hopeful that we are at a time in neuroscience where we're going to expand the set of diseases where we're able to have those kinds of really targeted interventions. So I'm optimistic as we look out over the next couple of years on that.
All right. And Mo.
I think, first of all, fantastic discussion, and thank you to you and Eric and Andy. Really exciting. I feel energized in this last 1 hour. I would say live locally, but think globally.
Mhm.
Competition is good. Change your state of mind from disease to finding and fighting diseases to a state of wellness. I think we're going through a transformation, and money will come. Find a way to be innovative and identify that unmet medical need and stay strong, and focus on your strengths, but recognize your lessons, your weaknesses, and find those lessons learned. It's a really, really exciting time. So I think globally it's a great state for us to be in. The US just has to stay focused and continue to do what we've done best.
All right. Well, thank you so much to our guests, Mo, Eric, and Andy. Don't forget that there will be a replay available of this webinar sent out to you, and a recap will appear in an upcoming edition of BioPharm Executive. You can subscribe to that newsletter in the top right corner of the BioSpace website. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and thanks for listening.